Thank you, everyone, for joining. Those who are tuning in, I'm just gonna give people a couple of minutes to tune in and then get started very soon. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. This will be a discussion among the panelists here, who I'm sure you're very excited to be hearing from. But we are also obviously going to be welcoming any questions or interventions from you, which you can put in the Q&A function, which we'll be monitoring through the discussion, and we'll come to your questions and weave them into our chat. So please hold tight just for the next couple of minutes, and we'll get started. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We've got people, I think, from Far East, I think as far east as Bangladesh, and as far west as the west coast of the United States. Thank you all for joining us today for this incredibly important webinar to discuss the systematic obstruction of humanitarian work by the Zionist State of Israel. I think the context will not be lost on most of you who are joining the audience of the Institute, but I will do a quick recap before introducing our speakers and then letting them take the floor and really kind of inform us of where we are at with regards to Israel's actions to obstruct this vital work that is needed to support a people being subjected to an ongoing genocide for over 2 years. So the historical backdrop here is a long-standing Israeli set of policies of control, coercion, and this goes, far back. Those of us who, recognize Sahar Francis will have seen her at least for the last 5 years going on about this with regards to the organization that she's been leading, which you'll tell us all about in a second. And then, we go even further back when we think about Israel's obstruction of ambulances, of organizations that may not align with the political framework that Israel and the various authorities that have taken control of Palestinian lives have tried to exert. So, the recent attacks on the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees may currently be going through a dramatic phase, but it is not new. It is long-standing, and it really stretches as far back as the history of the organization itself. When we think about the limits on Palestinian civil society organizing, that really goes back as far back as the British Mandate, the beginning of Western imperialist interests in Palestine and the occupation that has been inflicted for over 100 years. And the targeting of individuals who are engaged in whether it's political or relief or humanitarian work with Palestinians, is also long-standing. We'll be sharing various links through the webinar, but one recent paper I would encourage you to read is a paper by our colleague at the Institute for Palestine Studies, Laith Malhis, who wrote about a very long history of Israel targeting healthcare providers, and we'll provide a link shortly for that. And one of the things that I went through with the reviewer of that paper was, could we shorten it? And the answer was no way, because it is all vital. It is all very pertinent, especially considering the debates that we're having today, as if sometimes, obviously not us within the Institute for Palestine Studies, but sometimes within the media, within academic institutions, we're forced into a historicization of the long-standing Israeli policies of coercion and control. And so it's really important to always start with the historical context and really talk about the fact that these are all processes. Even the genocide is a process, even though there's obviously a defined crime which needs a start date and an end date. But the processes that enable genocide, that enable the mass killing of Palestinians, are long-standing indeed. So, without further ado, I'll move on to introduce our speakers very briefly, and then pose questions to them. So in the order that I'll be asking them the first question each. So Sahar Francis is a Palestinian human rights lawyer. She's been leading Addameer Association, which was in 2021 labeled a terrorist organization by the Israeli authorities and banned from continuing its work. We have Asil Baydoun, who is the Deputy Director of Communications and Advocacy at Medical Aid for Palestinians, and has worked in this field, I think, for about 11 years, if I'm not mistaken, Asil. James Smith is an emergency physician and a lecturer in humanitarian policy and practice at the University College London. He has volunteered in Gaza a couple of times over the past 2.5 years, and has also been involved in advocacy and activism on the European institution side, or kind of foreign organization side as well, which he will be introducing through his interventions as well. So if I start with Sahar, and I've already alluded to this, but can you please start us off by telling us, by really putting a historical frame on this, and by telling us about Israel's targeting of Palestinian civil society organizations, particularly since 2021, what happened and what has the effect of that repression been?
Good evening, and thank you, Laith, for this introduction. But as you mentioned, this is a long history process. It didn't started in 2021. Actually, the decision to designate Addameer along with other 6 Palestinian human rights and humanitarian health, agriculture, research organizations came after more than 15 years of smear campaign and intimidation efforts in order to attack us and reach this level where the Israeli authority can take the decision and claim that we are associated with terrorism. I think it's very clear that the attack on civil society is part of the whole colonial regime, because it was happening immediately after, also in 48 areas after the creation of the state, and later after the occupation, by using the British security regulations and the security justification to silence and attack civil society groups, whether they are political parties, whether they are unions, whether they are student movements. And it was extended to include health sector or educational sector or agriculture sector, depends on the interest and the circumstances that the state basically wanted to weaponize. And we don't have much time to enter into the details of this history, but let me remind all of us that immediately after the Oslo agreement was signed, the Israeli authority requested and actually designated most of the organizations, the Palestinian organizations in East Jerusalem, as illegal entities and forced them to leave the city and to move, claiming that an Palestinian Authority presence cannot be present in the city. And it continues. And in the latest 2 decades at least, what changed is the fact that the Israeli right-wing organizations were the key player in this attack and smear campaign against the Palestinian civil society. Like in the case of Addameer, in the case of the other Palestinian colleagues, it was the NGO Monitor reports, the UK lawyers' efforts, and the UN Watch and Regavim, Shurat ad-Din, long list of Israeli right-wing organizations that they organized this smear campaign, distributing false information, attacking our donors, the states and the European Parliament, or every politician that was criticizing and talking about the Israeli violations. So it started with the smear campaign and the effort to silence us, but when they didn't succeed in this, they went to the more higher step, like the decision by the Minister of Security in 2021, when he designated the 7 organizations. And this is a severe violation for the international law, because the Israeli minister don't have any jurisdiction over the occupied territories, over Palestinian NGOs registered in the PA. And later, 3 weeks after, they issued the order by the military governor. And it all, of course, based on secret information that were not disclosed or shared with the organizations. So it is also an arbitrary decision, not based legally.
Yeah. Thank you, Sahar. That's a really good introduction. I'm going to come back to that in a second. This interplay really between what seem like non-state actors, like the ones who are running the smear campaign, then turn out to be in the end actually doing the work, the dirty work of the Israeli state. We're going to come back to that. But first, just to give people a bit of background, maybe Asil, you can tell us about how, when we talk about some of these foreign organizations, particularly Medical Aid for Palestinians, I think people don't have a clear idea of how it functions. Tell us a bit about how MAP in particular, but how other organizations, if you've got insight, navigate how to work on the ground in Palestine. Just to also make it clear to everyone, the vast majority of these organizations have an overwhelming majority of Palestinian staff. The local staff are the ones that really carry out most of the work, but sometimes they are funded externally, or some of the funds come externally, or some of the management. So maybe if you can just tell us a little bit about how the management actually happens, and so where some of the control can start to come in. When can Israel intervene and start controlling what you're able to do and what you're not able to do?
Yeah, thank you, Laith, and good evening, everyone. I think let me speak only on behalf of MAP, because I think MAP is a very niche organization, does not represent other INGOs in Palestine, because MAP is only Palestinian focused in terms of themes, so it's not like an international organization. And MAP is locally led, meaning that all of our staff in Palestine are Palestinians, and we have an office in London. We don't call it an HQ office, it's just an office in London that supports us with the operations in terms of like reporting, papers, and they do most of the fundraising. So we are a charity, and the fundraising is mostly coming from individual donors rather than institutional donations. We recently started working on institutional donations, but the essence of MAP is actually like a community of supporters with individual givings and individual donors. So what we do in Palestine is like we have the biggest office in Gaza. especially after the genocide, it became the biggest office because of the needs. And we have the office in the West Bank, and we have an office in Lebanon serving Palestinian refugees. And because we're all Palestinian staff, issues like registration did not scare us at the beginning, because when we talk about registration, we talk about the control of Israel. And since we only operate in the OPT, which is like a Palestinian Authority sovereign regions, it should not impact our operations and our offices in the West Bank and Gaza, because we do have the Palestinian Authority registration like all NGOs. So if you want to come and work in Palestine, you have to register with the Palestinian Authority to be a credible organization within the Palestinian Authority. However, Israel as an occupying power, they control what goes in the Palestinian Authority and who goes in the Palestinian Authority. So that's why they enforce the registration system. Because, for example, if you want to get some aid into Gaza, like medical equipment, essential items, we have to get the approval of the Israeli authorities. And to get the approval of the Israeli authorities, we have to be registered. If you want to get medical missions, like Dr. James was one of the doctors who came with us several times into Gaza, we have to get the approval of the Israeli authorities to get doctors inside Gaza. And this is where the control life comes. So if we're not registered, that means we have no access into the West Bank or Gaza, because Israel as occupying power still has a control over the borders. I'm not sure if you wanted me to explain the work on MAP as an organization, or just how Israel can control our operations.
Yeah, please go ahead, and we'll hear from you about the kind of high level organization stuff, and then James can speak to some of the experience of being on one of those missions recently in Gaza as well. But obviously, it goes more than beyond just the work over the last 2 years in Gaza. So if you can speak to that, that would be very helpful, I think, for the audience.
So we have been working in Palestine for over 40 years, and basically what we do is healthcare sector. We try to support Palestinians building a resilient and developed sustainable healthcare system by supporting the Ministry of Health, by supporting community partners that work on different aspects of health, including mental health, disability rights, and emergency, complex surgeries. We do all kinds of support to the health sector in Palestine. And one of the biggest programs that we do alongside the work with the health sector is advocacy. And this is where the Israeli authorities do not really appreciate what we do, which is advocacy work. Because we believe, like, if we want to work with hospitals, if we want to work in emergency, we cannot actually do this without telling the truth of why we are there in the first place. So, for example, in Gaza before the genocide, we always supported, because they were living under blockade and they really had a developed healthcare sector. We did a lot of work with the limb reconstruction surgeries, because they have been going through wars and going through different, the March of Return demonstrations. And we have noticed that Israel always targets limbs, for example, leaving a lot of amputees in Gaza. So we had to do a lot of interventions with limb reconstruction. We had to do a lot of work to intervene with cancer patients, with neonates, and we also do a lot of work with mental health in Gaza. And recently we have been working with nutrition due to the, as Israel used starvation as a weapon of war, we are left with people severely malnourished, and now we have introduced the program of nutrition. Alongside the work in the West Bank, given the settler violence, the annexation, the after Oslo Accords, how each Palestinian area, some of them have the right to have health facilities, others Israel denied them the right to build health facilities. That left us with the need of mobile clinics. So in the West Bank, we have 4 mobile clinics supporting Palestinians in Area C, where they cannot have health structures. So we provide them with primary health care, and also we provide the Ministry of Health with support for trauma response. We make sure that their teams are capable of being responsive to the trauma and the influx of injuries. And we work with burns and cancer patients as well. So basically what we do, again, is supporting the Palestinian healthcare system. And what I do with our team is telling the stories of why we are there and why Palestinians are being obstructed from their healthcare rights.
Thank you so much, Asil, for that overview. I think all of that all of those needs really are becoming much more urgent with the accelerating practices of annexation and violence that are also going on in the West Bank. And, the news is happening so fast that even since the announcement of this webinar, we're in a completely different situation in the West Bank compared to where we were when we announced the webinar. And so, it's a very fast-moving situation for obviously the people, and then also for anyone who's trying to do any work, be it development, relief, or political work, indeed. The most recent, I'll provide another link here to this so people can read more about it, but there were a very large set of measures announced by the Israeli government in the last few days that really they are basically an announcement of the annexation of the West Bank. That's what they basically are. There are legal nuances here and there, but really it's about exerting much more direct control in the lives of Palestinians than ever before. And so we're not going to kind of touch on that in a lot of detail, but I think it's important backdrop to the overall frame that we're using here. It's about control and coercion, and that's really kind of heading in that same direction as well. But if we turn to James, please, and can you tell us of your experience of so you led a medical mission and was a member of another medical mission over the last couple of years in Gaza, working in different places. Can you tell us about the role that you saw foreign and international organizations play in the health system of Gaza, both the good and the bad, or kind of the good and what needs to be better, and how you see this, how you saw this develop really kind of over the course of the last 2 years as well, if you can touch on that, please.
Thanks, Laith, and thank you for organising this session. It's really a privilege to be able to speak alongside the three of you. So I worked in Gaza twice for a relatively short period of time, 2.5 months in total. First with Medical Aid for Palestinians, as Asil mentions, and then with a German NGO later in April through to June of 2024. I was there during the time that the Israeli occupation forces invaded and effectively destroyed the city of Rafah, which led to a series of delays with even greater obstruction of the movement of humanitarian workers and humanitarian aid. I tried to return to Gaza in May, June of 2025, again with Medical Aid for Palestinians on 2 separate occasions, and I was arbitrarily rejected on both occasions, which is commonplace now for humanitarian workers and increasingly for entire organizations, as is the case for MAP and many other international NGOs. In terms of the work that these organizations are actually doing, we have to appreciate first that we're talking about a really broad spectrum of organizations here, both in terms of the services they provide, but also in terms of their political orientation, in terms of their self-stated mandates. And that, of course, leads to a real variety of practices. I would say this, and not just because Asil is on this call, but I think Medical Aid for Palestinians are among a handful of that their work extends far beyond very and in my life for Palestinians were among some of the first to be trafficking in Gaza. Materially, these organizations
Sorry, James, you cut out a little bit and you were frozen. I think you're coming back now. But if you could repeat just the last 30 seconds, if that's okay.
Sure. Are you hearing me, Laith?
Still cutting out a tiny bit.
Hold on, give me a moment, folks. I'm just going to test my connection again. I'll come back to you, Laith. Bear with me 2 seconds.
Okay, no problem. In the meantime, I'll go to Asil again, if that's okay. And we heard a little bit from Sahar, the various different accusations and smears which precede the ban, the direct coercive measures. Can you tell us a bit about the accusations that are being leveled against MAP? What are the demands that have been made of the organization? That are the condition of continuing your work, or being able to register with the Israeli authorities?
Let me start with what we think happened and what the Israelis have published for public record. So basically, doctors like Dr. James, who were with us in Gaza, they really played a crucial role in being an eyewitness to the genocide. They went there. They saw what's happening. They saw all the atrocities that was committed against the Palestinians. And they came back home telling stories on media, participating in webinars, testifying to the UN on how deliberate Israel's targeting to the civilian population. And that created chaos to the Israeli government. Especially it was last July. One of the strongest testimonies of our doctors was for Dr. Nick Maynard, when he came out from Gaza saying that the Israeli army is playing a game on the Palestinians. Like each day of the week, they're targeting specific parts of the Palestinian. And that was verified by various doctors. And that was viral on the media, how Israelis are playing games on Palestinians. On Tuesdays, they shoot heads. On Wednesday, they shoot genitals. On Thursday, they shoot legs. So I think that was a headache, like having international doctors, having international aid workers in Gaza was a headache for the Israelis. And that was for us, our interpretation, that was one of the major reasons that they don't want us. And since that testimony, we were unable to get any international medical doctor into Gaza. However, according to the registration system that Israel has published on their what makes you registered and what makes you rejected, they said they have three conditions. Any organization, including any partner, board member, or funder, knowingly and publicly within the 7 years preceding the date of the registration application has called for boycott of the State of Israel, or participated orally or written in any legal proceeding against Israeli citizens in a foreign country, or carried any actions in the course of their duties, or any organization that actively promotes delegitimization campaigns against the State of Israel will be revoked. So meaning any organization that actually actively called Israel's atrocity crimes, called the genocide as a genocide, participated in any accountability work, will be revoked. And they also, in addition to all of these conditions, they asked all organizations to submit staff lists of Palestinians, of foreigners, and that breaches the privacy rights of Palestinians. In addition, that we're giving names of aid workers to the perpetrator who has killed hundreds of aid workers over the genocide. So that was a red line for us. We didn't even register as MAP. From the start, we said we will not play this game with the Israelis. We will not submit staff lists to the Israelis. That means we are jeopardizing the safety of our staff. Not only they want staff lists, they want to control who works with organizations. So for example, because many people told us but they already know who works at MAP. Yes, we know that they already work, but for us, giving them officially this information, that means, and they already did it with the World Central Kitchen. They started actually negotiating who's working and who can work with them, or who should be taken out based on relatives of relatives who work with Hamas or etc. So they actually wanted control of organizations, who works with organizations. They want to control what the organization says. We cannot call Israel a perpetrator, and they also want to control operations, where and how we operate. And from the start, we said we will not violate our humanitarian principles, and we will not participate and be compliant with the Israeli occupation and the intent of their control using aid in Gaza. And that's what we're seeing. They want to actually weaponize and privatize aid. And we said from the start we will not be part of this process. Therefore, now we are deregistered.
Thank you, Asil, so much for that. James, I'll let you pick back up where you started cutting out when you were talking about the different forms of the organizations, both in terms of their views and their services. And if you want to touch on, exactly the same as what Asil is just mentioning from your perspective, these coercive measures, and you as a practitioner and academic of humanitarian practice, your view and take on this.
Thanks, Laith. Sorry about that. I hope that the connection holds now. Yes, I mean, I was observing that these organizations exist across a real spectrum in terms of the activities that they deliver, in terms of their self-stated mandate and so on. And therefore, we need to really interrogate these organizations, both on that kind of individual basis, but also as an overarching sector that functions in a particular way. Materially, these organizations have achieved an awful lot. If we look at MSF, I mean, MSF in particular, in the wake of the announcement that Israel will ban MSF from working in Gaza in the coming weeks, has been very public about its operational footprint over the course of the last 2.5 years. Now, we can interrogate some of the numbers that MSF is quoting, but this is a sizable medical program, operating supporting 1 in 5 hospital beds throughout the entirety of Gaza, for example. Thousands of operations, hundreds of thousands of outpatient consultations. And this footprint, this NGO footprint, is in part driven, of course, by Israel's concurrent attacks on the sovereign healthcare system in Palestine. So we have a situation here wherein sovereign capacity has been systematically undermined over the course of decades, creating dependency on NGOs. And when that dependency reaches the height that it's reached, Israel now realizes that it has no strategic use for these organizations anymore, that they are more of a hindrance than any form of strategic help. And therefore, they are now the target of such obstruction. So material benefit, yes, varies, of course, but then there are the political effects of these organizations. And this is where Israel has derived additional benefit, not only from these organizations doing the work that it is legally responsible for as the occupying power, but the political effects of international organizations operating inside Gaza are significant. The first and most sort of widely documented is this notion of the humanitarian alibi, or the humanitarian camouflage, as some are calling it, wherein Israel has attempted to use the presence of these organizations and some form of semi-functional humanitarian sector to disguise the full effects of its violence and criminality. And indeed, if you look back at the proceedings of the first ICJ debates back in January of 2024, this was a core pillar of Israel's defense at the ICJ. And I'm going to quote here, this is from Professor Michael Shaw, a lawyer that represented Israel. He talks about Israel's actions by forewarning civilians of impending action by the unprecedented and extensive use of telephone calls, leafleting, and so forth, coupled with the facilitation of humanitarian assistance, all demonstrate the precise opposite of any possible genocidal intent. So here we have Israel saying, because we're allowing MAP into Gaza, because we're allowing MSF into Gaza, we can't possibly be also committing genocide. This, of course, we know is absurd. But it's a potent narrative, nevertheless, and many people have been convinced by it. So there's the material effects, there's the political effects, and of course these organizations play into this as well. I see that Professor Ilana Feldman is on the call, so I'm going to try and avoid doing an injustice to her extensive scholarship on this. But Professor Feldman has talked about how humanitarianism is not an area well suited for pursuing accountability. So this kind of humanitarianization of what's politically possible, these organizations have intentionally or inadvertently also played into that through a process of sort of humanitarianizing the genocide, if I can call it that. Perhaps I stop there, Laith. I don't know if you wanted me to delve into anything else.
I want to come back to this and really kind of tackle it head on, but I want to go to the practical first, if that's okay, just to see what lessons we can learn, especially that I think we're in this kind of interesting space with you three. So I'll go to Sahar, and I think Sahar, you're the one with the most experience with these kinds of measures, and so we have a lot to learn from you. It's been obviously a very long campaign. It's been 5 years of the ban, but you've faced, as you said, these smears, you've faced the attacks for a very long time, for much longer than the 5 years, I mean. And so if you could speak to, 5 years on from the ban, what's the current situation of the 6 organizations that were banned by Israel? There's one that was banned even longer. So, 5 years since the 6 years since I think the health work committees, and for example, how do organizations after being banned navigate what to do with their staff, what to do with their vital work? Some of them provide services, and on a personal level as well, it's been associated with a personal cost as well because of your involvement on a personal level. What can we learn? What have you learned, maybe from the past few years, and then we'll go we'll delve deeper into some of the issues.
Thank you, Laith, for this, but allow me before digging into the personal and the more practical lessons to highlight that based on what Asil and James also were arguing, that we cannot forget that the whole point and the whole aim of the Israeli colonization is to destruct and to destroy the whole international legal system. And no wonder that they were weaponizing all this attack and the claims against the humanitarian organizations claiming that they are associated with terrorism, because we have to connect it with the US campaign against terror back in 2001 and how this was extended in order to affect every single aspect of our daily life in the whole world. And this is continuous both from the Israeli side and the United States. And this is how they destruct all standards of international humanitarian aspects of the international humanitarian law. And based on this, actually, they were claiming not just against the 7 organizations that were designated in 2021 that we are associated with terrorism. Actually, this was the base for the attack against the World Vision back before, the Australian organization, the UNRWA, UN organization. The buildings were destroyed in East Jerusalem and no one did anything to stop Israel. I think the key point here is to be aware that all these practices are illegal according to the international law, and we shouldn't abide. And we decided, the 7 organizations, from day one to take the risk. Actually, after the Israeli designation and the decision, we didn't close the organizations. We continued working under the risk that we could be imprisoned as individuals. The offices could be raided, and actually it was raided, and they stole For other colleagues, all the equipments, all the property from inside the offices, and they repeated it lately, a couple of months, like 2 months, 3 months ago, against the agriculture work union. And we know that they can do it whenever they want, and not just against these 7 designated organizations. The Addameer office was raided 3 times before 2021, actually, in the second Intifada and in 2011 and 2019. But we managed, with the support of the local civil society, with the international organizations and the states. We cannot ignore the position of the European countries that they told Israel, we will not abide to the decision. But in my eyes, now it's not enough. After this escalation against the 37 organizations and the UNRWA, especially the European countries and all the third states should understand that if they don't take effective measures against the Israeli violations, the serious violations of the international humanitarian law standards, it will not stop. And let's take the decision of the ICJ last year when they confirmed that the whole occupation is illegal. So actually, instead of Israel forcing Israel to abide to the decision of the ICJ and ending their occupation, they're watching them escalating their measures against the civil society, against the Palestinian Authority, against the UN organizations, and so on, and not respecting any of these decisions. And I think should stop. And this will guarantee accountability. Without guaranteeing accountability, the Israeli occupation, the colonization will continue. And we are seeing this on the ground on daily basis. It goes for the destruction, the house demolitions, the land confiscation, the changes on the laws like happened last week on the West Bank and so on. The list goes and goes. So it's really the time for sanctions, real sanctions that will be very otherwise. For me, as a long-time human rights lawyer, the whole international legal system is at risk, and actually it's gonna disappear. If Israel is really allowed to commit genocide and to commit all these atrocities and to change the standards of the international law, the international humanitarian law that was developed after the Second World War, I think this is the end of this system. How you will impose or implement such standards on other contexts. On the practical level, I think, but also it's very important, especially for the international colleagues, that they also hire local colleagues, I mean the international organizations. On the personal level, it could be a very high price. The imprisonment and the attack against the individuals would be the most serious impact of all this process. But I think this also we can collectively find ways how to deal with raising awareness, with more discussions with the teams about their rights and how they can face it. What made the huge difference for the Palestinian organizations, and I think it will also, if it's done in the same way, will affect the international organizations, is the US sanctions that we didn't raise here. You know that in June, Addameer was declared by the US as well as a terrorist organization. Later on, the United States administration included al-Haq, al-Mizan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights also as illegal entities because of their work with the ICC, the sanctions against the special rapporteur for the occupied territory, Ms. Francesca Albanese, the sanctions by the US against the ICC prosecutor and judges. All these are connected, and we should look at them as the same frame for the destruction of the international system and should face it together.
Sahar, if I can come back to you with another question based on what you've just been saying. I mean, some people are arguing we are already at the point where international law has been dismantled, right? And we see this not just with the impunity, which is on its even on its own is a huge deal and should be, you know, the biggest alarm bell, but also with, for example, the establishment of the Board of Peace through a UN Security Council resolution, right? So it's got that kind of international legal cover, but then functions essentially as, or it is planning to function as a completely parallel system, both on a political level and on a services level, which is almost this kind of, you know, this next stage of international capitalism, where it's really just this billionaires club, whether it's from countries buy-in or the individuals who are the billionaires who are signing on. So, you know, how do you see a way out? Do you see that this could be salvaged, or you know, how hopeful are you with all of these developments now that it seems like we're moving in an even worse direction after the ceasefire?
Indeed, it's so frustrating and very difficult, but I think we cannot allow ourselves to lose hope, because imagine what would be the alternative: to live in a jungle and without rule of law, without respect for people as equal, and they have the same rights everywhere. I think should encourage us to think about that the whole system needs to be reviewed. I totally agree that the international law and with all these institutions in the UN level didn't work effectively in stopping the genocide, first of all, and not dealing with the consequences of this severe, the most actually serious violation in the textbook in the international level, the genocide. And should be the point where we start to think about the solutions. This hegemony of the powerful capitalist states like the US and some of the European countries that wants to dictate how the human rights system should be implemented should stop. And should be pushed by the southern and the more weak countries on the international level. And I think this is why it's very important to keep in thinking about how we can face these things. And I would also remind ourselves that with all this frustration from the international law and the international courts, let's think about the small successes that maybe we can see. The fact that a French court issued a warrant arrest against 2 Israeli soldiers, or the boycott and divestment and sanctions campaign, the successes, the mobilization on the international level with all the activists, the flotilla initiative, and all the mass movement efforts. This is what makes difference. This is what would keep the focus on these serious issues that we have to joint efforts to face. I think it could be seems at the first point very difficult that we can get over such Israeli measures. But honestly, if we are joining efforts and facing it together, I mean, on the issue of the organizations, the 37 international organizations should have a very open, clear discussion with the Palestinian civil society and jointly think about solutions and strategies how to face, and not to back up, not to take the Israeli decision and close their or end their services. and how we can push together in order to force the countries where all of these organizations are registered as well or have relations with the original countries. What's the role of these countries in pushing Israel to cancel these decisions and to enable these organizations to continue to offer their services for the needed communities?
Thank you, Sahar. That's a perfect segue to go to Asil to ask about, what is MAP doing? How has the response been, whether from the public, from politicians? What's the outlook at the moment? What does it look like? And what do you need? If there are people watching as well. Some of these people will be activists, some of them academics, some of them might be active in different ways. What is needed now to be able to carry on the work?
Well, there's a lot of things to be mentioned here, but let me start by just emphasizing, because I get a lot of questions on the registration and why we are deregistered, that Israel is framing it as administrative, punitive decision. And as Sahar said, we should always put it in the right context. It's just part of Israeli occupation and control of the Palestinian people, and its way of dismantling the Palestinians' life and institutions. So first of all, let's frame it in that perspective. People should understand it's not measured. It's not like what MAP has been accused for. It's what MAP has been doing for the Palestinians, rather, than what we have been accused for. So I just want to make sure that people understand the context is that we're fighting, all of us are fighting an occupation that has been living with impunity for so long, for decades. I really, Sahar, you're talking about being optimistic, but we are frustrated. Like, how many red lines Israel will continue crossing without facing accountability? Really, they have dismantled, as you just mentioned, the international system at whole, and they're still going on with facing no accountability. And for me, it's really hard to get every day and do advocacy work, really hard to motivate myself. Like, what system will I use? What will we name things if they're meaningless? And we have the US, like the US sanctions, a different level. Like, they didn't manage to stop human rights organizations by the Israeli designation, and then they added the US sanctions on top of it. So it's really frustrating, but I want to say what we are doing at MAP and what we need. So at MAP, we are, again, niche, that we're all Palestinian staff. So that means we're not waiting for international colleagues to come and do the operations. So we are continuing what we do in terms of programs, because we're Palestinians serving Palestinians. But that does not mean that we're not scared that our offices will be raided, or that one of our colleagues or some of our colleagues will be detained. We're also worried about the banking system, because if Israel has the control to put pressure on Palestinian banks to close our bank accounts, and that really adds so much complications to our work, like transfers, working with partners. But what we are doing now is trying to put all the mitigation plans together, enforcing and empowering our partners to work through partners, to find alternative ways, to think outside the box. And as you said, Sahar, what is needed the most is the joint work, the strategic joint work of all these organizations with the Palestinian civil society, of lessons learned. Unfortunately, you do have experience, like you have 5 years experience on top of us of being designated or being deregistered. So I think using your experience, using how a lot of organizations have already thought outside the box of how to stay resilient and continue doing the services. But it's not easy, because right now, what really makes me feel frustrated is, I'm not talking about the ongoing genocide in Gaza right now. I'm talking about the survival of my organization. And this is, from an advocacy perspective, it's really problematic. Like, we have been focusing in the past year on registration, on accusations, all this smear campaign against MAP, to a point that we don't want to lose the main focus. Our Palestinian people in Gaza are still on, like, the genocide is still ongoing. We're trying to do as much services as possible. Yes, that's true. but a lot of the managerial level are focusing on what, like the legal action on registration, on how to make sure that the organization will still continue operations. And I want the people here to understand is we have to make sure that the focus is on the Palestinians in Gaza and what's happening. And we need organizations like MAP, MSF, Addameer, a lot of other organizations to support the Palestinians in Gaza. And with that, we have to tell the right story. We have to tell that these organizations should not be asked what they did wrong. They should be asked how Israel is still not held accountable for all the atrocity crimes that they have been doing against the Palestinians in Gaza. And I'm not sure if what kind of campaign each one can do, what kind of collective campaigns we can do, who to target. But for us, like the UK government, to be honest, every time we have been targeting them, we have like a whole advocacy strategy of registration. They keep saying it's a political decision. And it's the end of every discussion. It's a political decision that we have no leverage on. We should be putting more pressure on the US. So right now, every door we have knocked, I have been knocking all doors of diplomatic missions and the UK in the past year. It ends with political decision. We have no leverage, only the US. And that's why we are still in the same position.
Thank you, Asil. James, if I can come to you on, the humanitarian sector, really, if we zoom out, really, and there's a lot to be said, especially picking up on what Asil said about, where the focus is and where it should be. There's also a question in the Q&A related to this, where there was this, let's call it what it is, chaos with MSF initially saying that they will share the lists, and then there seemed to be a lot of internal discussions going on, and then they decided not to. Other organizations from the start said, no, we're not going to. And there are obviously, aside from the ethics of this and the fact that, as all of you have alluded to, even sharing these lists are methods of coercion, of control. There's the ethical. There's also legal responsibilities that these organizations have. So Asil mentioned that as well. MAP it's simply not allowed through the laws that govern it, right? Like it shouldn't be allowed to share lists of stuff. Where does this variation then start to come in? And how is the humanitarian sector structured in a way that allows for that variation? And there's a related question, I don't know if you want to touch on it or not, which is related to essentially the operational side of the negotiation that these organizations have had to do for entry of food and convoys and as well as staff, as well as missions. So I don't know what direction do you want to take this in. So that might come in or it might not. I'll leave it to you if you want to comment on it.
There's a lot there, Laith. I'll try my best with the last question, but I might need to hand that back to Asil. I mean, with respect to, how are these organizations approaching the demands being imposed by the Zionist regime? I mean, the first thing really to emphasize is there is no one humanitarianism. There's no one humanitarian sector. This is a homogenous kind of a heterogeneous constellation of a variety of different organizations who make claims of humanitarianism. They adopt the rhetoric of humanitarianism. Many of them, we would say, are just very clearly not humanitarian. The most obvious example being the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was just a cover for more Israeli violence and dehumanization. But of course, there's a broad spectrum then of different organizations operating in very different ways with different modus operandi. There have been attempts over several years, not just for the sake of better coordination, but for very clear politically strategic reasons to ensure a more coherent voice from NGOs working in Palestine. So you have the Association for International Development Agencies, you have the Palestinian NGO network, trying to ensure that at critical moments, the sector speaks with one voice. And in my view, again, Asil, you may have a very different perspective on this, given that you work much more closely with these networks. But it makes it much more difficult to sort of single out and pick on specific NGOs if they're all speaking out and objecting to particular practices and strategies at the same time. Now, MSF, of course, had joined those calls earlier, saying that it wouldn't concede to the new registration requirements. Of course, there was a very chaotic situation in recent weeks, and I'm happy to get into that and speak a little bit more to my perspective of what was playing out there, though, of course, I don't speak for MSF. It was very clear that people were extremely upset about the lack of transparency, the lack of sort of clear governance oversight when it comes to questions that are fundamental, really, to MSF's humanitarian identity. The other important consideration here, of course, is that there's a lot of talk of red lines and moral thresholds in Gaza in particular. What does it mean to try and do humanitarian work amid genocide? And when we talk about red lines, what we're talking about are these sort of constitutive limits. The point at which, when you pass that limit, the substance of the action that you claim has been lost. You can no longer claim any sort of moral authority because the essence of the practice has been completely undermined and corrupted. Now, we've seen those red lines shifting in a way that I've never seen before in any other context in which I've worked with MSF or any other organization. And if the red line is moving all of the time, then of course it loses its moral and political utility. At some point, you have to say that we are not going to concede, that this is a step too far. And in the eyes of many people inside MSF and outside, the sharing of staff lists when there was a very real risk of further harm and further targeting for MSF staff. Bear in mind, of course, 15 of our colleagues, our MSF colleagues, have been killed in the last 2.5 years by the very entity that those staff lists would be shared with. Many people were saying, if this isn't a red line, then what is at this point? And of course, a lot of other NGOs felt deeply betrayed because, there is something to be said for this kind of coalition-based approach at this moment in time in terms of, your question, Laith, of what practical actions are needed moving forward. With respect to the question of how do we negotiate to enable the movement of people and the movement of commodities, I mean, of course, it's extremely complex to say the least. A lot of smaller organizations are facilitating material aid getting into Gaza through or under the umbrella of the United Nations. As far as emergency medical teams are concerned, so teams of international healthcare workers, most but not all were organized under the umbrella of the WHO. So the WHO has its emergency medical teams initiative. What to this day for me is unclear is the extent to which the WHO has done any serious advocacy when, upwards of about 50% of humanitarian workers under that umbrella were being denied by Israel arbitrarily. What exactly was the WHO saying or doing to try and negotiate an improvement in that situation? I still don't know. But of course, it would be a process that was heavily policed and heavily surveilled. When the Rafah crossing was still open, there would be a whole series of approvals on the Egyptian side, also, of course, on the Palestinian side, with Israel sort of behind the scenes, sort of surveilling and having its exerting influence in whatever way it could. Once Rafah was occupied, so since May 2024 to this present moment, the situation, of course, is even more fraught. Um, People will travel to Jordan with a view to then transiting to Gaza. They will often hear that they've been rejected the night before the UN convoys are due to leave. Of course, you then have to pass Israeli soldiers when you pass through Allenby and the occupied West Bank, and then again you interface with Israeli soldiers and the Israeli surveillance systems every moment thereafter until you reach Kerem Abu Salem and try and enter into Gaza. And again, there have been people turned back at Kerem Abu Salem as well. So the situation was extremely difficult before Rafah was militarily controlled by Israel, but it's extremely difficult now.
Thank you, James. So just a final question for each of you. Asil, it's really the same questions as James. Is there anything that you'd want to add on, he said, from your perspective, anything that from the operational side, from the you've already alluded to this, the negotiation side, there is no negotiation. There are systems of control, but anything that you want to add on this, or any final messages that you'd like to share?
Yes, I really want to emphasize that for MAP, the issue now is, for example, if we were unable to get international medical doctors into Gaza, if we were unable to get essential medical items into Gaza, what can we do in terms of programs? And we actually managed, in terms of the mitigation plans, to find a lot of things that we can continue working in Gaza without the need to access the borders. And we had like really extensive workshops with programs with the partners. And we have discovered that a lot of things that can be done in Gaza can actually be done for now without the need for getting things, without accessing the Rafah crossing. But what actually, if I want to say like more in details, there's a huge need when it comes to the health sector. There's a huge need of reconstruction. There's a huge need of medical personnel, and there's a huge need of medical items. So how can you actually find a lot of programs with the three pillars? For them to be achieved, you have to get access. And a lot of colleagues were really, really creative on what can be done. For example, there was a lot of work inside hospitals of rehabilitation, renovation inside hospitals using materials from other parts of hospitals. Many doctors managed to train other doctors inside Gaza. So I just want to emphasize on that point on the resilience and creativity of the Palestinian people when it comes to finding ways of delivering service. And I was really astonished by our Gaza colleagues when we presented the mitigation plans. What if the three key pillars with no access are unavailable? What kind of services we can still deliver? And honestly, I was really astonished by the work. I just want to say, like final notes, is we cannot allow this to happen. As Sahar said, we cannot just close offices and surrender to the Israeli machine, in a control machine. We have to find other ways. I know a lot of organizations started thinking of using different names, registering in different ways, everyone started being creative on how to find ways to continue the existence of services, how to find ways to continue telling the story of what's happening. And what we need is solidarity and information sharing. That's really lacking when it comes to the civil space and the shrinking space of the civil society in Palestine. We are really struggling to find people who understand what we are going through collectively in these institutions. And again, I just want people to share the story of what's happening in the right context. And I think for us, people working in the sector, to find ways of being creative together, because we're really facing an existentialist threat, not only as organizations, but as Palestinians. I don't think we have ever felt threatened everywhere to the extent we feel threatened now. And I think it's time to find ways to join forces on how to maneuver the threats that we're facing as organizations and as Palestinians ourselves.
Thank you, Asil. Final question for Sahar. I've received one offline, and then the same thing, if there's any final messages that you want to share. The question that I received was, have you seen a shift in how foreign diplomats perceive your work since the genocide and the televised onslaught? What do they say to you now? And, especially now that Israel is no longer even pretending to be benevolent in any way. It's really, the all of the masks are off, all of the facade. There's no pretending anymore. Has there been any shift in how you've seen people interact, especially within the legal space, within the diplomatic space? And then aside from that, any final messages that you'd want to share with our audience before we close?
I'm sorry maybe to say that in closed doors, diplomats would be totally sympathetic and understand exactly what's going on, and that it's a genocide and the masks fall and the need for justice and accountability. But does it reflect on political decisions or initiatives? No, unfortunately. And this is what matters, because as Asil said, it's the genocide is continuing, and all this propaganda actually is aimed to keep us busy in these practical issues and to distract our work on the ground, and not to focus on the main things here, that the main point behind affecting the work of 37 international organizations is actually to continue with the genocide and to affect any ability of any kind of reconstruction and supporting the people to survive and continue to live in their places in Gaza. At the end of the day, this is the continuity of the uprooting of the whole Palestinian people. We cannot ignore what's going on as well in the West Bank against the refugees, and this is connected to the UNRWA, why they are attacking UNRWA actually. So I think I totally agree with what James and Asil were saying. As well, wanted to highlight the need for continuing what we are supposed to do in different ways. We can be creative in order to protect ourselves, our colleagues, and to continue the work. Just thinking about the price that the people paid in Gaza, it's nothing. Like all the attack we are facing is not compared to what the people endured in Gaza in the last 2 years. And this is, for me, for example, what matters is the 9,300 prisoners that they are still inside Israeli prisons, subjected to torture, ill treatment, sexual harassment, and starvation, and all forms of serious violations. It's not the fact that Addameer is able to continue the work or not able to continue the work, how we will be able to continue the work. The question should be how we are going to succeed in ending the occupation and releasing all the Palestinian prisoners.
Thank you, Sahar. Completely agree with you. James, final question for you, and again, any final remarks that you want to make. And I think this is something you touched on already, but if we can maybe hear a bit more on the way that actually sometimes INGOs, even without Israel challenging their work, can sometimes perpetuate the sidelining of Palestinian sovereignty over health. If you could speak to some of the ways that can happen, some of the ways to combat that, And then also any final messages that you'd like to share with the audience.
Absolutely. Thanks, Laith. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these organizations do it perhaps without realizing, which I find particularly frightening. We've written about this in different fora. If we think about health specifically, we helped to shape the Gaza Health Solidarity Declaration, which outlines, some of the very basic actions that international solidarity organizations should be adopting, but also some of the practices that have been so harmful. Some of the very obvious kind of infrastructural and material dimensions relate to the development of parallel systems before those systems were necessary. So the construction of field hospitals when there was still, sovereign health infrastructure that organizations could have worked within and through. Very problematic hiring practices and a whole host of other issues that really anyone with a basic understanding of the political dynamics at play here would see that this is deeply problematic, and would avoid, to the greatest extent possible, from doing harm through the ways in which they structure their programs. Of course, other organizations, well, the entire sector needs to be aware of the ways in which it's been instrumentalized and manipulated by the occupation. I keep saying to anyone that will listen that Israel has never made a decision that is not ultimately to its strategic advantage. So if you are an organization or an individual that is being allowed into Gaza, it is serving a wider purpose. This is not being done as an act of pure benevolence. This is serving a wider function. And we need to be asking ourselves, what is that wider function? And to what extent are we willing to be part of it? What are the compromises we're willing to make? And what are the compromises that constitute red lines, so to say? With respect to perhaps some closing thoughts, Laith, I mean, looking forward, I mean, I'm extremely concerned, of course, about the sort of the political discourse at this moment in time. I mean, the Board of Peace is being lauded as this major political breakthrough. And I'm reminded, of course, of Kwame Ture, who writes that peace without justice isn't peace. It's violence by other means. And nothing is more clearly an example of that than the Board of Peace. He, of course, goes on to talk about liberation and the fact that we need to be centering a discourse around liberation. We as a humanitarian sector, need to be working in coalition. We need to have a much more sophisticated political analysis of what it means to work amid genocide, in the context of settler colonialism and under occupation. And I'm really just not seeing that at the moment. I hate to say that, but many organizations appear to have been blindsided by the move to ban, even though Israel announced that these new registration requirements were coming in December of 2024. The chaos that we've seen in MSF in the last few weeks and in other organizations, at least some of that could have been avoided in my view. And we need much more honest and open and transparent conversations about what I mentioned, our constitutive limits. What are the limits of humanitarianism under these kind of conditions? And how do we pivot and orientate ourselves differently? We seem to have sort of fixated on service delivery above all else, this kind of technocratic sort of managerialism that just flows through the international humanitarian system now. There's not enough talk of, our other responsibilities, what it means to advocate and to advocate effectively, developing new and more kind of courageous coalitions in order to advocate differently, engaging in acts of direct action. Again, why is it that we had reached a point whereby we were more willing to shake hands with the genocidaires before we were willing to chain our hands to the gates of the arms factories or the gates of the White House or 10 Downing Street. And these are very real conversations. I mean, I appreciate many people will just sort of write this off and say it's easy enough to say this from the comfort of an apartment in London. But these conversations were live in the context of the flotilla last year. Why more of these organizations wouldn't engage in acts of disruptive direct action. And it'll be very interesting to see whether any of the 37 banned organizations will participate in the next flotilla at the end of March. Will MSF now, given that all of its activities or many of its activities in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine are due to be obstructed, will they think differently about the limits of what they consider to be politically possible?
Thank you so much for that, James. Really, really appreciate these thoughts, these suggestions as well. I think let's take what each of Sahar, Asil, and James said as suggestions, and really make this the start of conversations that turn into actions. And this is really what I think every gathering such as this should try to do. Thank you so much. I will just tell our audience to please check the chat for ways to follow our work. So I'm a researcher at the organization at the Institute for Palestine Studies, coordinating a platform to document the targeting and destruction of the health sector in Gaza. And this work is interlinked with that, because it's also about thinking about the kinds of policies that we need in order to dismantle the systems, the structures that inflict violence upon Palestinians. That's really the aim. And you can follow the Institute's work in general. Of course, I've put links to both the websites in the chat. I really want to thank our three speakers, our three incredible speakers. The three of you know just how honored I am to have you share your insights with us. I think we are all humbled by the commitment that you have, and the dedication to your work that you demonstrate every single day. So thank you for being with us, but thank you for your incredible work, more importantly, and for your really pertinent message, which I will just repeat, which is, focus on the issue, focus on the real issue. The issue is the colonization, it's the violence. There is a lot that the colonizers will try to do to distract us from focusing on that violence, but the aim should always be to highlight and then challenge and undo the violence. That's what we're ultimately trying to do, and all of our work should be in service of that. So really, I think if anyone takes anything away from that, it should be this. We use institutions and organizations as a means to that end, and so that's where the work needs to focus. Thank you so much to our attendees for engaging, for watching, for your questions, and hope to see you in future events and actions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Layth.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.